The marble floors of Harrington Global Enterprises reflected the ceiling lights like mirrors, polished to perfection every single night by a man nobody ever noticed. Daniel Reyes moved silently through the empty executive lobby long after the suits had gone home. His uniform was simple, his name badge slightly worn, his hands rough from years of hard work, but his eyes carried something different. Calm, focus, strength. By day, the building belonged to power, to million-dollar deals, to sharp heels clicking across imported Italian marble. And above everyone sat the CEO, Victoria Harrington. Young, ruthless, brilliant. She had inherited the company at 26 and tripled its valuation in 5 years. The business world called her a prodigy. Her employees called her terrifying. Daniel had worked there for 8 months. Most people assumed he was just another janitor struggling to survive. What they didn't know was that every night after finishing his shift, he rushed home to his 7-year-old daughter, Sophia. She waited up for him no matter how late it was. He'd help with homework, make her breakfast for the next morning, and sleep barely 4 hours before starting again. He never complained. But that morning was different. The company was hosting a high-profile investor event. Billionaires, media, aviation executives. The lobby buzzed like a beehive. Daniel was finishing the last polish near the glass elevator when he heard sharp laughter echo behind him. Victoria Harrington stepped out, flanked by executives. Her eyes scanned the room critically. Then they landed on Daniel. She frowned. "Is this the best we can do?" she asked loudly, not even lowering her voice. "We're hosting aerospace investors, and the first thing they see is a janitor in scuffed shoes." The room went quiet. Daniel slowly stood upright. He didn't look angry. He didn't look embarrassed. He simply met her gaze calmly. One of the executives chuckled awkwardly. "We can move him to the service corridor, ma'am." Victoria smirked. "Yes, let's keep the image clean." The words were sharp, dismissive, designed to shrink him, but Daniel simply nodded once and stepped aside. Because Daniel Reyes had learned something a long time ago: never react emotionally when someone underestimates you. He returned to work silently. Victoria had already forgotten him. Until 2 hours later. The investor event was meant to be flawless. Victoria was preparing to fly several high-profile partners to inspect the company's newest aerospace manufacturing facility. They would travel in her private jet, a symbol of her dominance in both business and luxury. There was only one problem. Mid-flight, 30,000 feet above the ground, one of the pilots collapsed. A medical emergency. The co-pilot struggled. Warning alarms flashed. Turbulence rocked the cabin. Investors panicked. Victoria's confidence cracked for the first time in years. "Fix it!" she shouted from her seat, gripping the armrest. The co-pilot's voice trembled over the intercom. "We may need to make an emergency landing. I can't stabilize without assistance." And that's when a calm voice came from the back of the aircraft. "I can help." Every head turned. Daniel stood in the aisle. He had been invited onto the flight last minute, assigned to assist catering and ground logistics due to short staffing. Victoria stared at him in disbelief. "You?" she snapped. "This isn't a mop bucket situation." Daniel didn't flinch. "I'm a certified commercial pilot," he said evenly. "Former Air Force. 2,300 flight hours. I left to raise my daughter." Silence swallowed the cabin. The co-pilot shouted, "If you're certified, get up here now." Daniel moved fast, controlled, confident. Inside the cockpit, alarms blared. Daniel assessed everything in seconds. His hands moved across the controls like muscle memory had never faded. "Autopilot disengaged," he said calmly. "I've got it." His voice changed in that cockpit. Commanding, focused, He adjusted pitch, stabilized altitude, corrected the drift. Within minutes, the turbulence eased. The jet steadied. Passengers slowly unclenched their fists. Victoria sat frozen in her seat, staring at the cockpit door. The man she mocked, the man she dismissed, was now the only reason they weren't plummeting from the sky. After 20 tense minutes, Daniel guided the jet into a smooth emergency landing at the nearest airport. The wheels touched down like silk. No chaos, no crash, just control. As the aircraft slowed safely along the runway, the cabin erupted in relieved applause. But Daniel didn't celebrate. He exhaled once. Because to him, this wasn't about ego. It was about responsibility. And when he stepped out of the cockpit, Victoria was waiting. For the first time since anyone could remember, she had no words. The emergency crews escorted the unconscious pilot away. Investors gathered around Daniel, shaking his hand, thanking him repeatedly. Victoria watched it all. Power had shifted in a single moment. Reputation isn't built by titles. It's built by action. She approached him slowly. "I misjudged you," she said, the words clearly unfamiliar on her tongue. Daniel met her eyes again, the same steady gaze from the lobby. "You judged the uniform," he replied calmly, "not the man." It wasn't disrespectful. It was truth. Victoria felt it. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to her without fear. "Why are you working as a janitor?" she asked. "My daughter needed stability," Daniel said. "After my wife passed, flying international routes wasn't an option. So I chose what kept me home." There was no self-pity in his voice, only strength. Investors began whispering among themselves. One of them, an aerospace director, stepped forward. "You flew that descent cleaner than most captains I know. Why aren't you in the cockpit full-time?" Daniel gave a small smile. "Because being a father comes first." And that sentence hit harder than anything else that day. Victoria saw something she hadn't in years. Integrity. Real leadership. Not the kind that commands through fear, but the kind that stands quietly until needed. Later that week, the story spread through media outlets. Janitor saves CEO's jet. Headlines exploded. Social media praised him. The company's stock surged, not from marketing, but from authenticity. Investors trusted a company that had men like Daniel inside it. Victoria called an emergency board meeting, not to protect her image, but to change. When Daniel was summoned to the executive floor again, employees whispered as he passed. This time, no one looked down on him. Victoria stood as he entered. Stood. For a janitor. "I owe you my life," she said directly. "And I owe you an apology." He nodded respectfully. "I'd like to offer you the position of Chief Flight Operations for our aerospace division," she continued. "Flexible schedule. You set your terms." Gasps echoed around the room. Daniel paused. He thought about Sophia, her smile, her future. "I'll accept," he said finally. "On one condition." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "I want a scholarship fund created for single parents working in this company. Janitors, assistants, security, the people everyone ignores." The board members exchanged stunned looks. Victoria didn't hesitate. Done. And in that moment, power transformed. Not because a CEO commanded it, but because a humble man demanded dignity for others. Months later, Daniel stood once more in the company lobby. But this time, employees greeted him with respect. The scholarship program launched. Single parents cried during the announcement. Victoria's leadership changed. She listened more, observed more, judged less. Because sometimes the strongest lesson comes from the person you underestimated. And sometimes, The quietest man in the room is the one who can take control when everything falls apart. If this story moved you, if you believe never judging someone by their position matters, make sure you subscribe to the channel. The headlines should have been enough. Janitor turned hero. Single dad saves billionaire CEO. A leader hidden in plain sight. But the truth about power is this: when it shifts suddenly, not everyone celebrates it. 3 months after the emergency landing, Daniel Reyes was no longer invisible. As Chief Flight Operations of Harrington Global Aerospace, he had restructured safety protocols, retrained crews, and introduced stricter emergency preparedness systems. Efficiency increased, costs stabilized, investor confidence strengthened, and that made enemies, not outside the company, inside it. Some executives who had spent years climbing corporate ladders didn't like that a former janitor now sat at the strategy table. They smiled in meetings. They applauded his suggestions. But behind closed doors, resentment brewed. One of them was Marcus Caldwell, Senior Operations Director. Ambitious, polished, and deeply threatened. "He got lucky," Marcus muttered during a private executive dinner. "One emergency doesn't make him leadership material." Victoria heard about the whispers, but she didn't intervene. She wanted to see something, not whether Daniel could fly a jet, but whether he could navigate politics. Meanwhile, Daniel's life at home remained unchanged. He still woke Sophia up every morning, still packed her lunch, still braided her hair with clumsy fingers that had once maneuvered military aircraft through combat zones. To him, titles meant nothing if they cost him time with her. One evening, Sophia asked him something unexpected. "Daddy, why are people at school saying you're famous?" Daniel paused, because fame wasn't something he wanted her to chase. "I'm not famous," he said gently. "I just did my job when it mattered." She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Then why were they laughing at you before?" The question hit harder than any boardroom criticism. "Because children see truth clearly." Daniel smiled softly. "Sometimes people judge too quickly, but that's their lesson to learn." Sophia nodded. "I'm proud of you." And in that moment, no promotion in the world mattered more. The real test came unexpectedly. A new aerospace contract was on the table, one worth billions. It would place Harrington Global ahead of competitors for the next decade. But it required a demonstration flight of a prototype jet equipped with experimental navigation systems. It was risky. Marcus volunteered to oversee the demonstration. Victoria surprised everyone. "No," she said calmly. "Daniel will lead it." The boardroom froze. Marcus forced a smile. "With respect, Victoria, this is delicate technology." Daniel met Marcus's eyes calmly. "That's exactly why it needs someone who values safety over ego." The tension was thick enough to slice. Victoria leaned back in her chair. "The decision stands." For Marcus, this wasn't about aircraft. It was about dominance. And he wasn't ready to lose it. On the day of the demonstration, weather conditions shifted unexpectedly. Crosswinds intensified. A storm system rolled in earlier than predicted. Ground control advised delay. Marcus saw opportunity. "If Reyes aborts," he whispered to another executive, "investors will see hesitation, weak leadership." Daniel stood on the runway, headset on, eyes scanning the horizon. He could feel the wind change, feel the pressure drop. His instincts, honed by years in the Air Force, told him something wasn't right. Investors watched from the observation deck. Victoria stood silently behind the glass. Daniel had two choices: proceed and risk unstable testing, or abort and risk reputation. Marcus watched closely, waiting for him to choose wrong. Daniel removed his headset. "Flight demonstration postponed," he announced firmly. Safety override. A murmur of disappointment rippled through the crowd. Marcus stepped forward immediately. Investors traveled internationally for this demonstration. Daniel didn't raise his voice. And they'll return home alive because we respect physics more than pride. The wind howled harder seconds later. A maintenance crew scrambled as unsecured equipment rolled across the tarmac. Within minutes, lightning split the sky. Investors stared at the storm in silence. Victoria slowly turned toward Daniel. He hadn't saved her jet with flashy heroics. He hadn't taken this role to prove a point. He led the same way he lived. Calm, responsible, unshaken. Marcus looked away.